They laughed when they handed them heavy canvas laundry bags, cast iron scrub boards, and rusted pipe wrenches instead of armor-piercing artillery. They laughed when they deployed them to the most brutal, freezing, blood-soaked rear echelons of the European theater, absolutely convinced that their minds were too primitive to understand advanced battlefield strategy, and their blood too cowardly to ever hold a desperate line under fire. Imagine being drafted into the howling, sub-zero hell of the Second World War, surviving the bone-crushing rigors of basic training, only to be officially classified by your own government as a second-class labor pool. In the bitter, relentless winter of 1944, deep within the frozen, snow-choked Ardennes forest during the chaotic opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, this was not a philosophical debate about military equality. It was the agonizing daily reality for the men of the 244th Quartermaster Laundry and Sterilization Company. They were a segregated, entirely African-American unit of military boilermakers, steam fitters, and heavy mechanics. In the rigidly prejudiced United States military machine, they were explicitly classified as a disposable logistical asset. They were not issued heavy anti-tank guns, bazookas, or armored half-tracks. They were equipped with colossal, 10-ton industrial steam boilers, massive high-pressure autoclaves, and miles of thick iron piping. They were the invisible, freezing backbone of the Allied hygiene and supply chain, expected to silently plunge their hands into boiling, blood-stained water to sanitize the uniforms of the dead so they could be reissued to the living, absorbing the absolute worst of the freezing temperatures and the psychological horror of the war, while the elite white armored divisions pushed forward to claim the glory. Before we march into the freezing fog and the deafening hiss of the steam with these forgotten giants of the rear echelon, I need to know who is holding the stone factory with us today. These men washed the blood out of the infrastructure of liberation in absolute darkness, and in return, they were systemically erased from the history books. Whether you are watching this from a high-rise in London, a crowded street in Detroit, or a quiet rural town thousands of miles from the snow, drop your city in the comments right now. Let's map out our own global battalion in honor of the men the establishment intentionally left to freeze in the mud. The profound tragedy of the 244th Quartermaster Company was born from a catastrophic, deeply arrogant intelligence failure by the Allied High Command. Miles away from the suffocating, freezing horror of their isolated position, the American generals had confidently declared the eastern forest sector entirely impenetrable to heavy armor. They had ordered the segregated laundry workers to set up a massive, continuous sterilization facility inside an abandoned, heavy stone industrial factory situated at a critical crossroads. The black boilermakers spent 48 agonizing hours in the freezing gale, wrestling with colossal iron boilers and heavy water pumps under the relentless freezing rain, successfully bringing the massive thermal facility online. But the reality of the winter ground war was deeply unforgiving, and the German army had secretly massed for a massive counteroffensive. Deep within the blinding, freezing fog of the eastern tree line, an elite, highly mechanized vanguard of the Waffen-SS, supported by a terrifying column of massive, impenetrable panzer tanks and hardened assault infantry, had entirely bypassed the main American combat patrols. They were rolling silently through the frozen woods, preparing to launch a devastating surprise assault directly through the crossroads to capture the factory and shatter the Allied supply lines. Up on the high ridge overlooking the valley, a group of white American commanding officers and logistics captains had just arrived in pristine staff cars to inspect the facility. When they looked through their polished brass binoculars and saw the rapidly advancing wave of elite German armor pouring out of the fog, the local command structure entirely and instantly collapsed into a cowardly panic. The officers ordered their drivers to immediately turn the jeeps around, preparing to flee back across the frozen roads to the safety of the western base camps. As the engines roared to life, the commanding major sent a final, frantically typed radio transmission to the segregated laundry workers who were still standing in the freezing, wet stone halls of the factory. The message was sterile, brief, and completely devoid of any human empathy. The company of the 244th was ordered to remain in the hostile building. They were explicitly instructed to drop their heavy wrenches, pick up their light standard-issue M1 carbines, and physically barricade the massive wooden doors with their own bodies and washing machines to prevent the German armor from capturing the crossroads. There was no promise of an armored extraction. There was no timeline for heavy artillery support. The command simply weighed the lives of 150 black boilermakers against the time it would take to secure their own cowardly retreat, and cross the men out with a red pencil. They were biologically cheap, entirely expendable speed bumps, left behind to be slaughtered in the snow while the officers sped away to the safety of the rear lines. Panic, raw, suffocating, and completely mathematically justified, began to tear through the ranks of the abandoned Quartermaster Company. The massive, stone-walled factory was rapidly transforming into an inescapable, freezing slaughterhouse. The ground was already beginning to rhythmically tremble beneath their soaked boots, vibrating with the distant, terrifying mechanical thunder of the advancing Panzer tanks. The men of the 244th were trapped inside a stone box. They had no heavy anti-tank weapons, no explosives, and their standard-issue rifles were absolutely useless against 10 inches of hardened Krupp steel. It was a mathematical death sentence. The young men, drafted from the segregated neighborhoods of Chicago and the rural foundries of the Deep South, fell to their knees in the freezing, water-slicked stone, hiding behind pathetic stacks of wet canvas bags, praying to a god that seemed utterly absent from this cursed Belgian forest. But standing in the absolute center of the main boiler room, entirely ignoring the chaotic, terrifying roar of the approaching panzers, was First Sergeant Jefferson Boiler Hayes. He was a colossal, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, his heavy canvas uniform completely soaked and permanently stained with thick soot and rust. Before the war, Jefferson had not learned physics from an Ivy League textbook or a pristine military engineering academy. He was a master steam fitter and a heavy industrial boilermaker who had spent years working deep inside the sweltering, dangerous iron foundries and power plants of Detroit. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life manipulating the terrifying, uncompromising physical laws of immense thermodynamics, extreme thermal expansion, and raw pressurized vapor. He did not look at the advancing German armor and see an unbeatable military fortress, and he did not look at the freezing, stone-walled factory and see an inescapable grave. He looked up at the colossal, 2-story tall cast iron steam boilers they had just stoked to maximum capacity to heat the massive autoclaves. The officers who had fled expected these men to die cowering in the dirty water, fighting hopelessly with rifles against tank shells. But they had completely forgotten what these men actually did for a living. They were not just soldiers. They were the absolute, undisputed masters of extreme thermodynamic physics. "Listen to me!" Jefferson roared, his deep, gravelly voice slicing cleanly through the mechanical hum of the factory and the paralyzing terror of his men. His massive hands gripped a heavy, forged iron pipe wrench. "The brass ran away because they think we are nothing but maids. They think we do not know how to fight because they abandoned us in the cold. But we do not need their artillery. We are the men who control the heat, and we know exactly how to make this pressure break." Jefferson pointed his heavy, soot-stained finger directly at the massive iron pressure release valves bolted to the tops of the colossal boilers. "We are going to turn this entire factory into the biggest, heaviest thermodynamic flash bomb the world has ever seen. Drop your rifles. Grab every heavy wrench, every welding torch, and shovel every ounce of coal we have into those fireboxes. We are not going to shoot those tanks. We are going to cook them entirely inside their armor." The 150 abandoned laundry workers instantly transformed from a panicked, forgotten labor pool into a frantic, blindingly efficient forge of absolute battlefield survival. The sheer, agonizing terror that had paralyzed them minutes before was entirely burned away, replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifyingly focused mechanical rage. They were fighting for their fundamental right to exist, wielding the exact heavy industrial equipment the military establishment had used to humiliate them. They did not try to dig shallow trenches to hide from the incoming shells. They waded directly into the sweltering, soot-choked center of the boiler room, moving with the synchronized, rhythmic perfection of men who had spent years fighting the massive pressures of industrial steam. Under Jefferson's rapid-fire, highly technical orders, Squads of men sprinted to the massive anchoring mechanisms in the coal chutes. Working with sheer, desperate adrenaline, the men violently violated every structural safety protocol in the engineering manual. First, they completely sealed the primary and secondary pressure release valves on all 4 of the massive cast iron boilers, physically welding the heavy iron caps completely shut to ensure absolutely zero steam could escape. Then, they moved to the colossal fireboxes. Instead of running them at the standard operational temperature, the men shoveled thousands of pounds of raw coal directly into the furnaces, physically forcing the massive fires into a blinding, white-hot frenzy. They were pumping massive, continuous amounts of thermal energy directly into sealed, cast iron chambers filled with thousands of gallons of water, building the internal pressure to an astronomical, terrifying degree. Jefferson was engineering a catastrophic, highly unstable physical phenomenon known as a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, or a BLEVE, but scaled up to an apocalyptic, weaponized level. Water expands exactly 1,700 times its original volume when it converts from a liquid to a gas. By trapping tens of thousands of gallons of water inside a sealed iron box and superheating it hundreds of degrees past its boiling point, the liquid was physically prevented from turning into steam by the sheer, crushing internal pressure. The water was forced into a highly unstable, supercritical state. The entire 2-story cast iron boiler array began to physically groan and vibrate, emitting a terrifying, high-pitched metallic shriek as the superheated molecules strained against the immense, unnatural confinement. The entire factory floor was being weaponized into a macroscopic thermodynamic hair trigger, holding back a physical force that defied human comprehension. Jefferson positioned his massive frame directly beside a primary, heavy cast iron distribution manifold situated perfectly in the center of the main hall, right in front of the massive double doors. In his calloused, soot-stained hands, he held the massive sledgehammer. He looked at the heavy wooden doors, the air inside the factory thick with sweltering heat and the terrifying sounds of groaning iron. He knew the terrifying, uncompromising laws of extreme thermodynamics and the principles of macroscopic flash-vaporization. If he shattered the cast iron manifold while the massive weight of the enemy infantry and armor was concentrated inside the hall, the astronomically pressurized, supercritical water would not simply leak. It would violently, instantaneously seek physical equilibrium through the fracture. The sudden, instantaneous drop in pressure would cause tens of thousands of gallons of 500-degree superheated water to simultaneously flash boil in a microsecond. This flash vaporization would create a hyperdense, supersonic, expanding wave of superheated steam that would violently blow the massive iron boilers completely apart, acting as a localized thermodynamic bomb that would cook human flesh instantly and blow the heavy stone walls of the factory entirely outward. Jefferson was intentionally creating the exact catastrophic engineering nightmare that leveled industrial foundries. He was building a localized apocalypse made of raw thermal energy and cast iron. The boilermakers retreated behind the thick stone pillars at the far end of the hall, clutching their heavy tools, holding their breath as the distant, terrifying mechanical squeal of the German Panzer tanks began to echo through the snow outside. The elite predators of the Winter War were driving blindly toward the factory doors, completely unaware that the abandoned American laundry workers had just rewired the fundamental laws of physics to welcome them. The elite vanguard of the Waffen-SS surged into the courtyard with the terrifying, mechanized arrogance of men who believed they were invincible. The massive 30-ton Panzer tanks thundered forward, their heavy steel tracks violently churning the frozen mud, their main cannons blasting the massive wooden doors of the factory completely off their iron hinges. This was the apex predator of the European theater, a moving fortress of hardened Krupp steel that had ruthlessly annihilated infantry lines across the continent. The German assault infantry, armed with submachine guns and flamethrowers, poured through the shattered doorway into the main hall, expecting to find nothing but a chaotic, disorganized slaughterhouse of terrified American laborers cowering in the wet bags. The deafening, relentless roar of their own massive weapons and the chaotic shouting completely masked the terrifying, high-pitched, agonizing shriek of the highly stressed, thermodynamically overloaded cast iron boilers towering in the shadows directly in front of them. The German shock troops were entirely blind to the catastrophic, physics-defying industrial trap waiting in the heat. They pushed their massive assault columns directly into the center of the main hall, completely committing their immense numbers to the exact center of the kinetic kill zone. They were walking directly into the absolute heart of a colossal, highly unstable thermal spring, holding back millions of pounds of raw, unadulterated, explosive tension. Up on the distant snowy ridge, the white American officers who had fled lowered their binoculars, anticipating the brutal, inevitable slaughter of their own men and the successful capture of the crossroads. Standing in the blistering, suffocating heat at the edge of the stone pillar, his massive chest heaving with adrenaline, First Sergeant Jefferson Hayes did not blink. His calloused, soot-stained hands tightened around the heavy hickory handle of the sledgehammer. He watched the massive, heavily armed wave of elite SS infantry and a light armored half-track push deep into the center of the room, completely surrounded by the groaning iron of the boiler array. He could see the absolute confidence in the enemy's eyes, completely unaware that a segregated, blue-collar steam fitter from Detroit was about to violently rewrite the laws of infantry combat using nothing but thermodynamics. The heavily strained cast iron manifold, vibrating at Jefferson's feet, was screaming in mechanical agony, physically throwing off chips of black paint as the internal pressure threatened to tear it apart from the inside. Jefferson knew that if he waited even 5 seconds longer, the massive boilers would spontaneously rupture on their own, completely ruining the timing and destroying the trap. He took a deep, burning breath of the sweltering air, raised the heavy iron sledgehammer high above his head, and swung it down in a devastating, blinding arc. He did not hit the enemy armor. He struck the heavy, forged iron collar of the primary distribution manifold, holding back the violently pressurized, supercritical water. The deafening, sharp crack of the solid iron shattering under the extreme kinetic blow was instantly swallowed by a sound so entirely terrifying, so fundamentally unnatural, that it would haunt the nightmares of every man in that forest for the rest of their lives. When millions of pounds of mechanically stored thermodynamic energy are violently, instantaneously released through a sudden loss of pressure, the resulting physical reaction defies the human senses. The massive cast iron boilers did not simply burst. They violently, instantaneously transitioned into a macroscopic, hyperdense, supersonic thermal bomb. The sheer thermal force of tens of thousands of gallons of supercritical water, violently seeking equilibrium and flash boiling all at once, slammed outward. Within a microscopic fraction of a second, the entire factory hall transitioned from a stone room into a catastrophic wave of absolute thermal annihilation. The superheated water violently expanded 1,700 times its volume in a millisecond, creating a concussive, deafening acoustic boom that physically knocked the hidden American boilermakers off their feet. The catastrophic expansion of the 500-degree steam hit the incredibly heavy, fast-moving German vanguard with the crushing, inescapable thermal force of a localized volcanic eruption. The massive overpressure of the steam violently ruptured the thick stone walls of the factory, blowing the roof completely off the structure. The hyperdense, searing steam instantly penetrated the armored slits of the German half-tracks and tanks, violently cooking the crews alive inside their own steel armor before they could even draw a breath. The elite assault infantry were instantaneously swallowed whole by a blinding, horrifying matrix of churning white vapor, crushing overpressure, and flying shrapnel from the exploding cast iron boilers. The immediate aftermath was not a battle. It was a completely sterilized, absolute thermal erasure. The apex predators of the Winter War, the elite, heavily armed vanguard that had terrified the entire Allied command structure into a cowardly, disorganized sacrifice, had been instantaneously wiped from the face of the earth. They had not been defeated by superior armored tactics or heavy artillery barrages. They had been entirely obliterated by the terrifying, invisible laws of extreme thermodynamic physics and flash vaporization, weaponized by men who had been handed laundry bags instead of combat support. The absolute silence that slowly descended upon the ruined crossroads was broken only by the steady, relentless hiss of escaping steam from the twisted wreckage of the iron boilers, and the heavy, freezing snow falling into the roofless, sterilized stone hall. The 150 African-American quartermaster engineers of the 244th slowly, shakily, pushed themselves up from behind the remaining stone pillars. They were entirely exhausted, their uniforms completely soaked in water, soot, and sweat, their ears ringing with a high-pitched, agonizing whine from the supersonic shockwave of the thermal explosion. They staggered to the edge of the steaming, utterly destroyed main hall, gripping their heavy tools, and looked down at the absolute, unimaginable devastation they had just created. The invincible German vanguard was completely gone, entirely erased beneath a towering, chaotic graveyard of twisted steel and heavy white steam. Jefferson leaned heavily against a remaining chunk of masonry, wiping a thick layer of wet soot from his exhausted face. He looked at the young laundry workers from Chicago and Detroit, men who had been explicitly told their entire lives that they were cowards, inherently inferior, and unfit for the rigors of combat. He watched as they stood tall in the freezing air, realizing that they were not pack mules, and they were not disposable. They had held the absolute center of the line. They were the undisputed, absolute masters of the pressure. They had survived an unwinnable war by rewriting the very physics of the atmosphere. For 3 agonizing hours, the company of the 244th held the ruined, steaming factory entirely alone, waiting in the freezing, oppressive snow for an enemy counterattack that never came. And then, slowly cutting across the frozen road from the western ridge, came the heavily armed jeeps and pristine staff officers of the American command structure. The generals had not come back to launch a desperate rescue mission. They had explicitly sacrificed the boilermakers hours before, fully expecting them to be slaughtered and the crossroads to be captured. They were only coming back now because the deafening explosion had ceased, and they wanted to assess the loss of their tactical position. As the spotless, heavily armed command vehicles pulled up to the steaming, roofless ruins of the stone factory, the white military officers standing on the dirt were completely paralyzed by absolute, slack-jawed incomprehension. The commanding major, a pristine, aristocratic man who had cowardly fled across the forest in his jeep, stepped onto the wet snow. His polished leather boots gleamed in the harsh weather, completely untouched by the mud and the blood of the infantry. He lowered his binoculars, his face pale with utter confusion. He looked at the massive, completely destroyed German armored vanguard, swallowed in the thick, lingering steam of the shattered building. And then his gaze shifted to the edge of the ruins, where 150 black boilermakers stood defiantly among the vapor, holding their heavy wrenches and sledgehammers. First Sergeant Jefferson Hayes stepped forward, his massive frame towering over the cowardly major. He offered a slow, heavy, utterly exhausted salute. "The crossroads are secure, sir," Jefferson's deep, gravelly voice echoed across the silent snow. "The enemy vanguard has been completely neutralized. We held the line." The commanding major did not return the salute. He gripped his pristine uniform coat, his eyes darting frantically from the catastrophic destruction of the cooked armor to the exhausted engineers. In his rigidly segregated, deeply prejudiced worldview, the reality standing right in front of him was mathematically and fundamentally impossible. "You neutralized them, Sergeant?" the major asked, his voice dripping with cold, aristocratic disgust and heavy, undisguised condescension. "You expect me to believe that a segregated laundry company stopped an elite SS vanguard without anti-tank guns?" "We used the heat, sir," Jefferson replied, his jaw set like carved granite, completely refusing to back down. "We sealed the pressure valves and super-stoked the fireboxes. When their armor breached the hull, we shattered the manifold. The sudden depressurization caused a catastrophic flash boil, and the thermal overpressure blew the walls out." The major stared at the massive steam fitter for 5 agonizing seconds, and then he let out a sharp, cruel, entirely dismissive laugh. It was a laugh born of sheer, terrifying insecurity. "Let me tell you what actually happened here, Sergeant," the major sneered, shaking his head and pointing a pristine, gloved finger at Jefferson. "This German vanguard obviously suffered a catastrophic, direct hit from a massive, high-altitude Allied bomber, and the heavy munitions simply leveled this building. And you and your panicked labor crew came crawling out of the cellar after the fact to claim the glory." Jefferson froze. The accusation was so profoundly vile, so entirely detached from the horrific, brilliant reality they had just survived, that for a moment, the massive sergeant could not even speak. My men stood in this freezing hall to build that pressure when you sat in your tent, and we broke it to kill them when you ran away, sir, Jefferson growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, heavy rumble of pure working-class fury. We built that steam. We cooked those tanks. The Major's face flushed a violent, defensive red. The terrifying idea that a company of black laborers had outsmarted, outfought, and completely outperformed the white officers who had cold-bloodedly sacrificed them was a narrative his fragile establishment pride simply could not accept. Acknowledging their heroism would force him to explicitly acknowledge his own profound, sociopathic cowardice. The only thing I see here, Sergeant, is a massive, unauthorized destruction of a multi-million-dollar United States military logistical facility, the Major snapped, pointing at the completely ruined, roofless stone factory. You intentionally sabotaged our strategic supply lines because you panicked and blew the boilers instead of fighting. The Major turned to the heavily armed military police stepping off the jeeps. Disarm these men of their tools. Arrest First Sergeant Hayes immediately. I am charging him with gross negligence, dereliction of duty, and the willful, malicious destruction of critical wartime property. The heavily armed MPs leveled their submachine guns, aiming them directly at the exhausted, soot-soaked men who had just saved the entire Allied flank. The betrayal was absolute. It was a crushing, suffocating weight that hurt infinitely more than the freezing cold or the terror of the German assault. They had faced the ultimate enemy, commanded the terrifying laws of extreme thermodynamic physics, and won an entirely unwinnable war. And their only reward was to be stared down by the guns of their own commanders. Their impossible, physics-defying heroism was instantly erased, stolen, and buried by the very cowardly establishment that had intentionally sacrificed them to die in the snow. This is the exact reason you will never find the name Jefferson Hayes, or the heroes of the 244th Quartermaster Laundry Company in your high school history textbooks. The United States military brass entirely, aggressively sanitized the official after-action reports. The destruction of the elite German vanguard was officially, falsely, credited to spontaneous structural collapse and targeted Allied heavy bomber squadrons. The 150 brave, brilliant men of the Quartermaster Company were quietly split up, threatened with general court-martials if they ever spoke of the true events, and shipped to other forgotten, freezing outposts to continue washing uniforms in the dark. Their unimaginable brilliance, their sheer industrial genius, was completely buried beneath mountains of redacted, classified paperwork and systemic arrogance. But the absolute truth is permanently written into the shattered bedrock of that Belgian crossroads. The truth lives in the calloused, soot-stained hands of the working-class men who actually bleed in the deepest, most dangerous corners of the earth, doing the heavy lifting while the cowards at the very top steal all the glory and aggressively hide the evidence. This history is your inheritance. The establishment tried to sanitize the truth, just like they tried to sanitize the battlefields. They expected these men to die quietly in the wet bags, but they used the very tools of their oppression to completely shatter the enemy. Now, it is your turn to fight the second phase of this war, the war of memory. The algorithm of this platform is exactly like the prejudice history books of the 20th century. It favors the comfortable, easy lie over the difficult, bleeding truth. It wants to bury this history. Do not let them. If this story made you feel a profound sense of awe, anger, or pride, you have a duty. You are now a soldier in the regiment of memory. Share this video. Send it to anyone who thinks history is only made by generals with silver stars on their shoulders. Post it on your timeline and force the world to look at the faces of the men who were intentionally sacrificed by their country and still found a way to win. And before you scroll away to the next distraction, go to the comments right now. For the men who fought the freezing cold, the crushing pressure, and the cold-blooded betrayal of their own commanders, leave a final roll call across time. Type the words, "We break the pressure." Let's build a massive wall of text in the comments that no bureaucratic cover-up, no cowardly general, and no algorithm can ever erase.